I first wrote an exhort on the subject of change, I think it was about 28 years ago. Seems a very long time. And I was a very different person back then. I was a fundamentalist for a start, and I was a lot younger. I didn't have 15 kilos of excess fat on my stomach, and I hadn't become a middle-aged father. So some of those changes have been good. And at the time, I was very resistant to the idea of change in our community. Mainly, I think, because I had the wrong idea about what change really means to a religious community. And I was also, of course, concerned about the idea that people were changing things just for the sake of change. And I haven't changed on that point. I still agree that we shouldn't be changing things just for the sake of change. Change shouldn't be arbitrary. Change should have a purpose. And the primary purpose of change should be to grow, to mature, to improve. And Christianity, of course, is a religion of change. When you first become a Christian, you find that you have to change the way you think and believe about certain things. You're required to change your way of life. And you're required to change the way you treat other people. Christianity is a religion of personal change. And when you get enough people experiencing a personal change, they can start to change a community. And that's a really great thing. And it's one of the best things that Christianity does. It changes communities. It helps them to mature and improve and grow. Christianity, of course, changes over time, has always changed over time, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Sometimes it's the beliefs and practices that change, and sometimes it's just organizational issues. And sometimes Christianity is forced to change, to adapt, to survive, as it did during eras of persecution, and even today, persecution in countries around the world, though thankfully not ours. But Christianity itself was established on the principle that change is necessary. Personal change, mental change, and spiritual change. Christianity calls us to recognize that maturity cannot be achieved without growth, and growth cannot occur without change. So Christianity accommodates change on a case-by-case basis because it is a living faith, not a dead one. But the problem is that we don't always agree on what needs to change, or when it needs to change, or why it needs to change. And those disagreements can fuel division. And those divisions are probably the main reason why the idea of accommodating change makes many people feel uncomfortable, as it did for me many years ago. But they're not the only reason, because changing any significant part of our worldview or the way we live our life is challenging. And if the change is too sudden, too rapid, too great, it can be quite traumatic. As humans, we're typically reluctant to move from a comfortable position of absolute certainty to a position of unqualified certainty, or even a position of ignorance. It can be difficult to go from saying, I am absolutely certain about what that verse means, I've always been certain and I'll always be certain, to then go to a position of, well, I can appreciate that verse is not as certain as I thought it was. It can be interpreted legitimately in different ways, provided those ways don't contradict each other. And sometimes we might even reach a position, I thought I knew what that verse meant, but I honestly don't know anymore, because I've looked at the way I used to see it, and I don't think that interpretation is valid. And now I'm not sure. I am open to suggestion. And that's a healthy thing, but it's often a difficult stage to reach. Someone once asked me actually about the passage where it says the Spirit makes groanings and utterings for us. They asked me that the other day, and I used to have a standard answer for that because I thought, yep, this is the answer, and I'm absolutely certain what it means. And the answer I give now is, well, I'm honestly not quite sure. I'm not satisfied that my original answer was accurate. I'm not entirely sure it was accurate. And I honestly don't know how to interpret that verse now. And I'm open to any other interpretation with a decent amount of evidence behind it. So we're cautious, naturally, of the implications of change. We want to know what's on the other side of the fence before we jump over it. And we can be doubtful of the motivations for change, and fairly so. Change must be made for the right motivations. We are wary of mistaking arbitrary change for legitimate change. And sometimes we're suspicious that change in one small area might produce an avalanche of greater change in more significant areas. When we finally decide that change is needed, we have to justify it to other people, particularly if it's a change that we're inviting others to share. So what do we tell them, and how do we make them understand our point of view? And if they don't understand, or if they do understand but simply disagree, then how do we work with that? And depending on the nature of the change, what if there are implications for fellowship? And how do we address this issue? When people talk about change in Christianity, it's very often easy to mistake this for changing Christianity. And what people mean by that is, well, I don't want to change Christianity. Christianity has a set of essential beliefs. I don't want to change those. I don't think they need to change. If they're essential, they don't need to change. And I agree with that. Although these days, I think we need to be a little more realistic about what constitutes an essential doctrine. Because I think some of the definitions we've used around that term aren't as biblical as we once thought they were. And changing a Christian community doesn't mean changing Christianity per se. Doesn't mean overhauling a 2,000-year-old religion and starting from scratch. But change is very biblical, and spiritual change, belief change, is very biblical. And the way a community, a faith community, behaves and manages itself changes. And that's biblical too. The Jews themselves were forced to change when they were in exile. They lost the temple, they lost the sacrifices. They had to adapt to a new way of keeping their faith. And that new way worked very well, although sadly, of course, it was hijacked by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, who turned it into a tool of abuse and manipulation. But let's look at some positive examples. We've got many positive examples of personal change in the New Testament. The disciple, Peter, the thief on the cross, the Ethiopian eunuch, and the tax collector, Zacchaeus. But I think the most dramatic story of personal change involves the conversion of the Apostle Paul. And I find this story particularly instructive because it seems to me that Paul's perspective on change within a religious community was shaped by the nature and the circumstances of his own experience. Let's go to Acts 22, verse 3, and see how Paul describes himself there. Paul says, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in Jerusalem, educated with strictness under Gamaliel according to the law of our ancestors. I was zealous for God, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way, even to the point of death, tying up both men and women and putting them in prison, as both the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. Notice the points he highlights. He's a Jew, born in a Gentile area, but raised in Jerusalem according to the strictness of the Gamaliel school. Zealous for God, persecuted this new religion. Now let's see how Paul describes himself in Philippians 3, verses 5 to 6. Here Paul strongly emphasizes his Jewishness, his traditionalism. I was circumcised on the 8th day from the people of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. I lived according to the law as a Pharisee. In my zeal for God, I persecuted the church. According to the righteousness stipulated in the law, I was blameless. And now finally, let's see how Paul describes himself in Galatians 1, verses 13 to 14. Again, Paul harks back to his very firm, very aggressive form of belief and practice. For you have heard of my former way of life in Judaism, how I was savagely persecuting the church of God and trying to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my nation and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. Now, it's passages like these which have led many people to conclude that at this stage of his life, this pre-Christian stage, Paul was a raving fundamentalist with a very narrow view of the world that was subsequently opened up by his conversion to Christianity. But nothing could be further from the truth. And I think it's important to make this point because fundamentalists aren't the only people who can be unreasonable. Paul was a Hellenized Jew. He was a Roman citizen, very cosmopolitan person. He was trained as a Pharisee under Gamaliel in the school of Hillel. And unlike the more conservative school of Shammai, Hillel's curriculum included Greek poetry and philosophy. And Paul demonstrates his knowledge of Greek literature throughout the New Testament. He quotes the poets Epimenides and Aratus in Acts 17:28. He quotes Menander in 1 Corinthians 15:33. And he quotes Epimenides again in Titus 1, verse 12. So Paul's use of classical literature and the nature of his education reflect an open-mindedness to ideas outside his own language, culture, and religion. And that's important because it tells us that Paul recognized that truth is truth no matter where it is found. As the 15th century Augustine of Hippo would later put it, all truth is God's truth. Now, Paul's experience on the road to Damascus is typically described as a conversion. But I prefer to call it a revelation because his conversion was really a process, not a single event. When zealots are converted from one religion to another, they often remain zealots and they start acting as if they've always been a member of the faith that they've only just adopted. And you can also see this in deconverted fundamentalists. Fundamentalist Christians who become atheists typically retain their fundamentalist mentality. They simply transfer it to a different worldview. and they remain very narrow-minded. But Paul didn't do this. It wasn't his experience, and it's important to understand why. Firstly, his reputation as a persecutor of Christians prevented him from simply integrating himself into the Christian community from day one. Christians didn't trust him. Christians didn't believe him. Christians didn't even want to be near him. Secondly, Paul had come to see the error of his zealotry. He had gained a new perspective which was no less devout, but clearly more nuanced. Thirdly, Paul had been humbled by correction. He had encountered new knowledge that contradicted a lifetime of firmly held beliefs. And this was an immensely challenging experience. But because Paul trusted the source of that new knowledge, he adjusted his views accordingly. And let's see how Paul describes his response to the revelation on the road to Damascus in Galatians 1, verse 15. Paul says, "I did not go to ask advice from any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me. But right away I departed to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and get information from him. And I stayed with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." This is important information. Paul tells us, the Galatians, that he did not receive his teachings as a tradition from the apostles at Jerusalem. He's not their subordinate, but rather their equal, insofar as he too has received a personal commission from Jesus. Paul says he spent time in Arabia and Damascus. We don't know what he did there, but it seems likely that this was a spiritual retreat during which he familiarized himself with the details and the theological implications of his new faith. Doubtless, he also made new friendships. He established a fellowship with his new community. Paul emphasizes that it was a full 3 years later that he finally met Peter and James, 2 pillars of the church at Jerusalem. So this is an account of a sincere and reflective conversion, a mature conversion, a mature approach to change by someone who recognizes what he's doing and why, and is thinking very carefully about the process. And I believe it provides an example for our own approach to change in the Christian community, where sincerity and reflection are of paramount importance. Of course, we know that changing a religious community is no simple task. We can barely agree on changing carpet or other forms of decor in an ecclesia, let alone anything significant. And too often, change results in conflict because some parts of the community are changing at a different speed to other parts of the community. And people worry. They say, well, can we accommodate these changes without losing fellowship? Is it possible to have a multi-speed church community? The answer to both of those questions is yes, and I think we should know this already because our own church community has been running at different speeds for some time now. Churches disagree on many issues. Typically, issues that we agree are not issues of essential doctrine. But I think perhaps increasingly, in some places, we might even start to disagree on which issues constitute essential doctrine. We accommodate, of course, other forms of disagreement and change. We disagree on divorce and remarriage, on forms of worship, on prayer to Jesus, on the role of sisters, on the atonement to some extent. Well, at least we have an atonement war every 10 or 15 years or so that's clearly something we're still working with. And to some extent, we disagree on the basis of fellowship. So how did the early churches address the issue of a multi-speed community in which there was disagreement over what constitutes essential doctrine? This is where I think Acts 15 is really useful. So let's go there now. Acts 15 verses 1 to 2. Now some men came down from Judea and began to teach the brothers, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." When Paul and Barnabas had a major argument and debate with them, the church appointed Paul and Barnabas and some others from among them to go up to meet with the apostles and elders in Jerusalem about this point of disagreement. Now what follows in the rest of the chapter is a detailed description of what we now know as the Jerusalem Conference and the recommendation that it issued to the other churches. This recommendation is notable for several reasons. Firstly, it presents a compromise, not an absolute or an ultimatum. Secondly, it accommodates Jewish Christians who are still committed to practices that they wrongly believe are essential. Thirdly, it accommodates Gentile Christians without placing undue burdens upon them, and it reassures them that they are not required to follow the Jewish Christians in their personal belief and practice. Fourthly, it requires both groups to accommodate each other. Finally, and most importantly, it does not instruct any church to withhold fellowship from any other church or any members within that church. Notice that the principal advocates for accommodation at the Jerusalem conference were Peter, Barnabas, and Paul. Now, Peter's testimony is significant because we know from other passages that he had struggled with this issue personally. We know there was a time when Paul even rebuked him for this. And just like Paul on the road to Damascus, it literally took a miracle to change Peter's heart. The result of the Jerusalem conference, however, was not a foregone conclusion. We are told in verse 7 that there had been much debate by the time Peter finally rose to speak. But there was a willingness to resolve the issue in a way that favoured inclusion rather than exclusion. There was a desire to resolve the dispute without harming the community. And this same approach was used by Paul in his advice to ecclesias facing issues that threatened to tear them apart. Time and time again, Paul demonstrates the breadth of his capacity to accommodate other people. While he still taught against error and urged patient correction, he nevertheless shared fellowship with Christians who still observed parts of the Mosaic law. He shared fellowship with Christians who believed in demons. And he shared fellowship with Christians who abstained from meat. Paul did this because he had a positive faith that accommodated those whose faith was slightly divergent from his own. In his mind, no essentials were compromised by accepting a range of views sincerely held that fell within the broad tent of fellowship defined by a short list of core doctrines. And I say short quite deliberately because the confessions of faith that we find in the New Testament and in the earliest extra-biblical literature of the church are refreshingly simple. They are concise and entirely positive, They only list what is confessed, not what is denied. They begin with Christ, not with Adam. They do not use technical or outdated language. They do not split hairs or quibble over definitions. They do not introduce unbiblical concepts, and they do not contain amendments. The essentials of our faith can be summarized within 6 concepts: God, sin, humanity, Jesus, community, destiny. When we understand what these words represent, there is no need for debate over smaller matters. And if we choose to disagree, we can recognize that those matters are small and not really as significant as we might have once believed. Jesus died for all of us, not just a few. And if we aspire to unity with him, we must seek unity with each other. In the words of Paul, there is one body and one Spirit. We are called to the one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all.